On one occasion, when Jesus was going to the house of a leader of the Pharisees to eat a meal on the Sabbath, they were watching him closely. When he noticed how the guests chose the places of honor, he told them a parable. When you are invited by someone to a wedding banquet, do not sit down at the place of honor, in case someone more distinguished than you has been invited by your host, and the host who invited both of you may come and say to you, "Give this person your place," and then in disgrace you would start to take the lowest place. But when you are invited, go and sit down at the lowest place, so when your host comes, he may say to you, "Friend, move up higher." Then you will be honored in the presence of all who sit at the table with you. For all who exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted. He also said to the one who had invited him, when you give a luncheon or a dinner, do not invite your friends or your brothers or your relatives or rich neighbors, in case they may invite you in return, and you would be repaid. But when you give a banquet, invite the poor, the crippled, the lame, and the blind, and you will be blessed, because they cannot repay you, for you will be repaid at the resurrection of the righteous. The gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, O Christ.
Are you seated? In a congregation like this, where people are accustomed to responding to a phrase of the pastor, like, "The Lord be with you."
Also with you.
Anyway, like me, he encountered some problems with his microphone. So he said, "There's something wrong with this microphone." And the congregation answered, There's another old story about the new pastor in the congregation who preached the same sermon. The first sermon he preached it over and over again every Sunday. At first, the people thought it was kind of an interesting novelty, but became irritated, and finally someone worked up the courage to ask him. And he said, when you start applying that first sermon to your faith and life, I'll start preaching another one. Now, I brought one of 3 volumes of the sermons I preached when I was a pastor here at Grace that Barb Radke so laboriously put together. And I did think of, rather than preparing a new sermon, of just looking up one of my old favorites here and reading it to you. And it wasn't because I don't think you put my sermons into practice, and it wasn't that it would be a whole lot easier than preparing a new sermon. But it was because the gospel today is really a puzzler. And if you look at it, you would think that Jesus was some kind of a first-century Miss Manners. In fact, I usually don't read the Sunday paper till Sunday afternoon, but I stopped and picked it up today, and I quickly paged through it. I couldn't find the Miss Manners column, but I wondered what the subject was today. But Jesus was not a first-century Mr. Manners. There's got to be something more here than being a good guest and a good host and avoiding embarrassment. So how I'm going to get around that is I'm just going to arbitrarily apply this not to our table manners, but to our personal faith and our together faith, our community of faith. And so I have 2 H's for you. And I was telling someone before the service, the old saying was a good Lutheran sermon has 3 points, but the best answer, how many points does a good sermon have? It should be at least 1, but today there are 2. And there's going to be a quiz at the end, and it'll help you pass the quiz if you would grab your bulletin really, really quickly. For those who want to, you don't have to do this, but if you want a good mark in your quiz, in the Hebrews lesson, just underline the words, do not neglect to show hospitality. Do not neglect to show hospitality. And on the other one, the second line, they were watching him closely. And then at the end of that first paragraph, the last sentence, for all who exalt themselves will be humbled. Those who humble themselves will be exalted. Another old saying about preaching is, and this is obviously old, that pastor sermons should be prepared with the Bible in one hand and the newspaper in the other. Of course, now it's the Bible in one hand and the computer in front of you. But day before yesterday, the newspaper came right out and gave me a good help. This is on the opinion page. Search continues for humble prophets. Now the first thing, and that first H is, whoops, I'm ahead of myself. I'm going to do it the other way around. The first H, I'll give you that one again. The first H is hospitality. When I went to visit Mark Schultz about bringing the message at Gloria's funeral, the first question he asked me, how would you summarize Gloria in one word? And my response was just instantaneous, hospitable. Many of you remember when Bishop Herb Chilstrom preached for us when we were still worshiping as Amazing Grace over at First. And after he heard of Gloria's death, he sent me a note, and in the note he mentioned the hospitality. Gloria loved to have guests and serve meals. And we have a little file of 3x5 cards in which she took notes, presumably so she wouldn't be repeating the same menu to the same people. And about 3 weeks ago, I happened to come on a few extras. And this one it's herb chicken, which was a hot dish, hot fruit compote, Ponderosa rolls. She didn't bake her own rolls. She went to Ponderosa and got them. And strawberry pie. And the heading on top is Call Committee, 1975. Kathy Paul, are you here? Uh-oh. But anyway, Kathy Paul was on the Call Committee, and she remembers one of these menu items. She asked for at that time. And I remember so clearly exactly where I was standing when the telephone call came in, and Jim Fisher said, our call committee is recommending you to be pastor of our congregation. And, you know, I was pleased, of course, but surprised because I knew all the other pastors that were being interviewed and so on, and I thought they all were probably better fitted to this call than I was. And through the years, I often ask myself, how come the call was extended to me? And I think one of the reasons was that simple hospitality that we invited the call committee over for Sunday noon meal after they sat there and criticized me probably in their minds. God calls us as a church and as a congregation to be hospitable. Those of you who work closely with me know that it's just one idea after another tumbling out, and thankfully most of them never take place. And there was one I thought about for many years that I never took place, but on the Sunday when the gospel lesson was about the Good Samaritan, my plan was to dress up like a bum, you know, unshaven, I get disguise, sit on the sidewalk out here where most of the people come in with fake vomit beside me, and wonder how many people would walk to the other side of the sidewalk to get in, and then when the time for the sermon would come, out would come this bum. Now, I don't know why I never got around to it. Hopefully it was because I thought it was kind of unfair. It was kind of mean. God calls us to welcome, especially those not so good. I was so I don't know what the word was, interested to see that Ella and Diane Lowe are here. Ella is the widow of Pastor Obert Lowe, who was with me for 20 years here. And Diane is his daughter. Well, anyway, when I got the word that I was going to receive the call to Grace Lutheran Church, I hopped in my car and drove over to Calvary Lutheran Church to visit with Pastor Lowe. Pastor Lowe had built that congregation from 200 to 2,000 members. He was Mr. Pastor as far as I was concerned. I have a doctor friend who lives on a lake shore, totally surrounded by pastors, and I made a sign for his dock saying, "Please do not walk on the water," because thinking how disgusting it'd be for this doctor trying to watch the sunset and these pastors walking back and forth. Well, most pastors can't, but if someone said, "I saw Pastor Lowe walking across the Chippewa River," I wouldn't have doubted it for a minute. And one of his gifts was to bring people here who probably don't fit the usual profile of most mainline Lutherans. And they tended to fill up this entire area. Somehow, he found a way to make this a welcoming place. Many of you remember when Alice and Hilmer Mostul were here in our midst for quite a few years. When he retired as pastor in Menominee, they moved to Eau Claire, and the first church they visited was Grace. And of course, being recognizable people, some not only just welcomed, but knew who they were and said it would be really wonderful if you would join Grace. They said, "Well, thank you, but we want to go to a small church." Time passed. I don't know if it was a month or two. All of a sudden, one Sunday morning, Alice and Hilmer walked in. They said, "We're going to join Grace. We think it's the smallest church in town." Hospitable, hospitable. I don't, does Grace at all still use the logo with the circles and with the G in the middle? Yeah, well, anyway, there was always a debate about that G, if that stood for Grace or God or Gordy, but most people hopefully thought stood for Grace. And so we had some badges made for the ushers, just with that logo on it. Then someone decided to hang a cloth banner under it, you know, like a prize at the fair, with the word usher, until some of the ushers refused to wear it because it said gusher. Can you think of anything better than an usher and members who would gush a little bit over welcoming strangers? God calls us to be hospitable. Several years ago, I was surfing the television, and of course, Gloria was being patient, as many women need to be with their husbands in that case. And I happened to stumble in the middle of a funeral service for Walter Cronkite. And I pictured the people sitting in the pew being all high-powered TV executives and Wall Street people and politicians and so on. And the priest, in the beginning I didn't know if it was Catholic or Episcopalian, but the priest did not waver that I could tell one word from the way he would have done it in some little country church. Took no account into who was sitting in the pew, but just did his thing the old way. I was impressed with that, so I played phone tag. I found out it was Episcopal Church, St. Bartholomew's. Played phone tag with the priest for about a week and finally caught him and thanked him for just not tailoring his message to who was in the pew. Then he started talking about what it was like to be a pastor in Manhattan, the kind of people who came to the church door. And then he said, my idea of a good church is one that's loose at the edges, but tight at the core. And he said when people start visiting my church, I say you're welcome to come just as you are. Whatever you believe or don't believe, you are welcome here. But the more you become involved, the closer you get to the center, the more you will discover what we're really about. And too often what I see, it's the other way around. Tight at the edges and loose at the core. Don't get me going on that one. God calls us to be hospitable. That's the first H. Now I'm getting to the second H. Humble. Humble. The search continues for humble prophets. Now this is applied to the election this year. But I would say that the world is looking for humble prophets. And certainly we are called to be humble prophets, not proud prophets. One of the complaints about the 7-Eleven churches, that's the kind of church I attend most often. 7-Eleven means the songs have 7 words and you sing them over 11 times. And one of the other complaints about those kinds of churches is that they don't have a confession of sin at the beginning. And those of us who are old-time Lutherans always accustomed the first thing right off the bat. We'd say, we confess that we are sinners. We sin by thought, word, and deed, by what we have done and what we have undone. And Karl Menninger, famous, one of the most famous American psychiatrists, founder of the Menninger Institute, wrote a book, Whatever Happened to Sin? Whatever happened to confession of sin? And now I find out we don't have a confession of sin here either. And we're not even a 7-Eleven church, at least not in the usual beginning place. We are invited to a meal. The gospel lesson says that Jesus was invited to the meal at a home of a very prominent Pharisee. Now we're invited to a meal. Now I'm really on thin ice here. I really don't know what to do because I want to say it, but maybe I shouldn't. But I didn't realize that at this church now, communion elements are brought up as part of the offering. And Pastor Barb and I discussed the other day as we were planning this service about what precedes the actual words of institution. This is my body, this is my blood. Very typically a prayer from the cranberry-colored book reads, "We ask you to mercifully accept our praise and thanksgiving." Now, is communion really a potluck meal in which the host provides the entree and we're invited to bring a salad or dessert? Do we really have something to add to God's mercy or to offer? Well, I don't know, maybe something, and don't be offended that I bring this up, but think about it. Just think about it. So an item that's been in the news over and over again the last 3-4 days is this drug company that's raised the price of the stuff for people who are allergic to bee stings, and they raised the price 400 or 500 times, or whatever it was, percent. When daughter Amy was an infant, that was before the days of car seats, but we had a kind of a folding mesh crib that was in the back seat, and we were driving from Grand Forks, North Dakota, down to Fargo, North Dakota, when all of a sudden Amy started just screaming. So I turned to stop the side of the road. Gloria got out, and first thing she was to see if there was an open diaper pin. Now, I know that a lot of you don't know what that is, but diapers used to be made of cloth, and you would fold them a certain way, and then you would hold them together with a safety pin on the side. And sometimes they would open up and poke the baby. Diaper pins were okay. And then she noticed in this mop, thick mop of dark hair, a big yellow and black bumblebee had drilled itself into the scalp. Well, even back then, which is more than 39 years ago, we whipped the car around and went back to a clinic in Grand Forks because we had heard that could even be fatal for some people. Well, I brought that story back, it came back to my life when I saw all this stuff in the news about this company that's probably going to result in some people unnecessarily dying because the parents can't afford that expensive magazine medicine. But anyway, there's another story that went with it. I heard about the man driving the car and his little daughter was with him, and all of a sudden a bumblebee was in the car. And the daughter, realizing, and she was that type, realizing the danger, began to scream, and the father reached out and grabbed the bumblebee, and the little girl settled down. And after a moment, he opened his hand, and the bumblebee flew out. And the daughter started to scream again. Dad said, "It's okay, honey. Look here." Was a stinger in his hand. It can't hurt you anymore. All we have, dear friends, holding on to us is that nail-scarred hand. We have nothing more to bring. Nothing. Zero. Zilch. We come to God open to His mercy and to His gift. When you get older, there's stuff you miss that you used to be able to do. And I miss not being able to sing. But I think of George Beverly Shea and wonder how many Billy Graham crusades he did not sing the song to which he wrote the melody. I'd rather have Jesus than silver or gold. I'd rather have Jesus than have riches untold. I'd rather have Jesus than houses or lands. I'd rather be led by His nail-pierced hands. Lesson started out by saying that people were watching Jesus closely. And so yesterday I texted my 3 offspring and asked them, when you were young, did you feel that, is it still on? That you were being held to a higher standard because you were a PK, preacher's kid? And one of them answered, well, not really. Didn't sense that. I had other problems adjusting to the new town here, but. And another one said, yes, definitely. Maybe that's why I was so rebellious at that age. And then in a second text, said, when you asked that question, I expected that it was going to be part of a sermon. And I'm still not ready to confess everything. And I have a message to that person. I don't want to know. Keep it to yourself. But I like all those responses, but this is what the third kid wrote. I felt as if I were held to a higher standard. I observed other preachers' kids acting in the opposite manner, deliberately being overly unruly. that seemed fake to me, or perhaps pointlessly self-destructive. I did not think highly of those kids. I tried to model the higher standard. I did the bad things too, but it was always balanced by the good. And I think that's what God calls us to be. And, we're being watched. But rather than taking that as a negative and saying, oh boy, I'm so constrained now because everyone's watching me because I claim to be a Christian, let's turn that around and say, the fact that we're being watched, let's use it as an opportunity to be and to believe as God would have us be. And so what are the two of the most important things, the two H's? The first is God calls us to be hospitable. And secondly, God calls us to be, especially in our approach to Him, not a so often read Old Testament book, Micah, chapter 6, verse 8. And what does God require of us but that we do good and love mercy and walk humbly before our God? A word of prayer. Lord, people are watching us. Help us use that as an opportunity to believe and to live as you would have us. And just for today's thoughts, to be, as a church, very hospitable. And as we come into your presence, humble. Amen.